It looks like we're live.
Great.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lori Beth Goldman, and this is episode number 52 of Exploring Genuine Transformation. For those of you who don't know me, I am a psychotherapist and a psycho-spiritual mentor, and I work with women who have been in the personal growth space and the spiritual development, whatever you want to call it, world for a long time and still feel stuck. And so I'm helping them to resolve lifelong trauma by using somatic, spiritual, and therapeutic tools so that they can stop being a self-development project and enjoy their lives and find peace and meaning now. So that's a bit about me. This show is a show about where I am interviewing different coaches, teachers, thought leaders, therapists, all on the realm of transformation. And what we are looking at here is not a kind of transformation that gets you what you want in life per se, but an inner transformation that brings more intimacy with self, with life, more interdependence, more peace, more freedom and well-being. So that's a little bit about the show. And I'm really excited today to be interviewing Oren Jay Sofer. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, happy. Thanks for having me, Lori.
And so the topic today is individual healing and social forces, and we'll go into that in a moment. But I'd love to introduce Oren to those of you who do not know him. And Oren is a very dear old friend of mine, probably of maybe 15 years, actually.
Yeah, I think longer even, right?
Yeah, maybe longer. Yeah. So I'm very well aware of him as a human who I just deeply respect and trust, and also as a teacher. And as he's a Buddhist meditation teacher, as well as he teaches nonviolent communication. And he wrote a book called Say What You Mean, A Mindful Approach to Nonviolent Communication. And he's also the co-author of Teaching Mindfulness to Empower Adolescents. He's also a part of the Spirit Rock Teachers Council, and he teaches all around the US. Maybe you also do you teach in other parts of the world or mostly the US?
Mostly the US these days, yeah.
Yeah. And I would also say that you're you're really bringing these practical skills that, like, bringing the Dharma, like Buddhist Dharma and, these kind of wisdom teachings, as well as different ways of communicating with kindness and compassion into more of like, how do we do this in our daily lives? And also, how do we do this for the world? How do we do this, not only for our own self, but how can our practice of those things basically support larger social issues and also larger social forces that are out of our control? And how can we use that to support our world in a better way? So is there anything that you would add before we get into
that's the question that I'm most interested in and that I hope all of us are asking these days. Speaking of social forces, maybe just a brief technical thing as we're getting started here. I can't find the live stream on Facebook. I want to share it to my page. Are you seeing it? Is it under Lori Beth Goldman or Psycho Spiritual Mentor?
Sorry, it's under Lori Beth. That's my Facebook page. Yeah.
Lori Beth, right.
Yeah, so it is live. Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'll just take one more quick look.
Yeah, sure. Mm-hmm.
And I'm revealing my techno limitation.
Well, you didn't know my Facebook name, so.
No, I've got you there, Lori Beth Goldman, but for some reason, should it just show up in your feed?
No, it's Lori Beth because it's on my personal page. So you're looking at my business page.
Okay. Well, let's not take any. I mean, I do see Lori Beth There's a picture of Bali and you in a nice dress.
Yes. So
Yeah.
you're not, so it's not showing that it's live. Huh.
No, not on my end. I mean, maybe it is for you or other folks, but
It is for me. Let's make sure we've got this. That's odd. I want to make sure it's live now. I do see it on, yeah, I see it on my.
okay, as long as it's showing up on your end, that's what matters. It's for some reason, as a visitor to your page, it's not appearing, but I'm going to assume that it's showing up live for other folks and for you. And then if not, I guess we can always post it later.
Yeah, actually, because you said that, I'm going to record it on Zoom so that here we go. All right. So we just did that beginning, and hopefully that is showing up on my page. It does appear that way, but thanks for just
Great.
clarifying.
Yeah.
Yeah, so is there anything else besides that you want to add to the intro, say about yourself? Okay.
No, let's dive in.
Great. So we have some questions, but we can just start with I think kind of the bigger question, which is, what is the relationship between individual healing and the larger social context? And what's the role of meaning and purpose in individual and collective healing? So this is a huge question.
Those are big questions. I forgot the first one already. Say the first one. We'll start there.
What's the relationship in your view on between individual healing and the larger social context?
Sure. So I think maybe we can just start here and see where the conversation goes. I think one of the limitations of individual healing practices and modalities, and I would include Buddhist meditation in that category, although obviously the Buddha's path is much more than just about individual healing. One of the limitations is that by default, we're only seeing things from our own perspective. Mm-hmm. So if I am meditating, examining my thoughts, my emotions, my personal history, I'm limited by my perspective, which is going to be defined not only by my life experiences, but by my social location, the experiences I've had growing up in society, what gets reflected back to me. And so the danger, if individual healing practices are not informed by an awareness of social structures and the ways that socialization and systemic issues shape the individual, if that's not happening, the danger is that we will miss key dynamics and patterns that we've internalized that are not personal, that are actually reflections of larger social forces. And this insight, I think, in the modern era originated in the feminist movement with the kind of key phrase, the personal is political, right? That sense that what we take to be so intimately ourselves, and this is how I feel and who I am and how I see the world, has actually been shaped by our society. Mm-hmm. So just to ground it in a concrete example, say, from my personal life, and I think you know this about me from being so close over so many years. I got a really strong dose of perfectionist conditioning. And so for many years, I would struggle feeling overwhelmed with whatever was happening internally and externally. And I had to do it all my own and hold everything on my own. And that it was up to me to, feel better emotionally or take care of all the tasks on my plate. And it took a lot of work to realize that I could ask for support, that I could reach out, that I didn't have to hold the stress of whether it's having a lot of work to do or feeling down or in pain emotionally on my own. Mm-hmm. Now, what I didn't see at the time that through other conversations and reflection and learning has become much, much more clear, is that very pattern of thinking, I've got to do this on my own and it's all up to me and it better be perfect or else, was implanted in me by our society as part of my identity as a man, as a white man, as an educated upper middle class white man, right? So the inner experience that I've had as Oren, and this is just the way Oren feels and experiences the world, is actually an imprint of those larger social forces. And then we could apply that same insight to many other areas, whether it's male dominance or white dominance. So to go back to where the question, where you started from, one of the things that I'm most interested in right now in my own practice, in my teaching, in my conversations with others, is how do we start to become more aware of those social forces and the impact they've had on us when the very experience of them appears to be so intimate and personal, when in fact it's often due to larger forces.
So then, I mean, those were great examples, and I'm curious if we take it back to, like, let's take Buddhist practice, because that's what we both know so well. You know, how what is the danger do you see when people, let's say, are engaging in a meditation practice, let's say over time, and they're in a daily way, or even you know, even let's say on a long retreat, if they are not really considering these larger social forces and how they shape us?
Sure. I think they're different pitfalls. I think that on one end of the spectrum, like the least damaging would just be that it takes a lot longer to reveal some of the patterns. And the Buddha was very clear about this in some ways. It's interesting, if you look back at the early texts and the teachings, the Buddha, there's a huge emphasis on what's known as right view, which is the teaching that says how you look at things is really important. And if you're not looking at things from the right perspective, you're not going to get to where you want to go. You're essentially, the map that you're using needs to be oriented properly in relation to reality. If you've got a good map, but you don't know which way north is, it's not going to help you very much, and you might end up going in the wrong direction. So right view is about getting the map and then getting it aligned properly for liberation. And the Buddha says, well, what is the cause for having the proper perspective, for understanding our relationship with the world? He says, well, there are two things that can help that perspective arise. And one is our own careful attention. So really looking closely and deeply at our experience and our mind. The other is the voice of someone else, which is profound. It's what it's pointing to is that we can't see our own blind spots, and we need someone outside of us to point certain things out. So one of the dangers in individual practice, if we're not bringing in social and systemic perspectives, one danger is that we're just not going to see certain patterns or understand where they come from. It'll take us much, much longer, if we ever get there at all. So, you know, one of the examples that's come out more recently in the Buddhist world with the influence of the Black Lives Matter movement is the kind of unconscious, unintentional white dominance or white supremacy within Buddhist communities and teachings, whereby the whole architecture, literally and figuratively, of a meditation center, a meditation retreat, the community, the culture, is a reflection of white culture, and how alienating and unwelcoming, if not exclusive, that is for people who don't identify with the particular culture that the practices and the community are reflecting. And one's not going to see that until you get that feedback or that reflection from outside oneself. And so individually, that might look like not recognizing certain patterns of entitlement or certain blind spots around race or gender or class if we're not applying those filters. So that's at one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum, I think that one of the more higher stakes dangers is that if the practice hasn't matured to a certain degree, or we could say like in the process of maturing insight and wisdom, we take our own view and experience as being universal or absolute.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, the ultimate trajectory of the Buddhist path, which is why it's so radical, is letting go and not knowing and being more humble. Mm-hmm. Is actually putting things down rather than picking things up and fortifying a sense of I know and this is the right way. It's more going in the other direction of being like, well, I'm not really sure, and being open to not knowing, to seeing things differently, rather than fixating on one particular view. But in the process, some of the dangers and pitfalls are that if we have some level of insight or understanding, we mistake that for the truth. And if you add social power into that, then the very experience of my awareness or my insight is actually being colored by the social forces that have shaped my own personality and my own experience. Mm-hmm. And then to not see that and assume that that is the truth, or the whole path is kind of starts to get colored by that. And then if we're in a position of power, as I am, as not just having social power as a white person, but being like a teacher in the Buddhist community and so forth, if I'm not attending to those, I'm then reinforcing and passing on those blind spots to students or people who follow me. So the impact of that gets amplified the more we have power positionally or socially.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's, I mean, we could make the same parallel for, the sort of coaching world as well. I mean, we could probably say it for the therapy world too, but I think the same, when anyone is in a position of power and they're not looking at their blind spots or looking at their privilege and how they're coloring things are being colored, right? And then kind of like teaching something and or sharing something and saying this is the way, but actually not kind of acknowledging that it's coming from a certain lens,
right,
as well, I think can just be so highly problematic. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because right now we're talking about, I mean, I want to go to the other side of this. I love everything that you shared. And it's like, we're talking about how social forces actually, you could say larger social forces or like systemic issues, right? That they inform who we are. And it's like, I've even heard, and I think I always think about this, like I often think about this. I remember hearing this once from someone a long time ago that like, it's like our thoughts are not even really our own. They're actually just like passed down from generation to generation, right? Not even in this like lifetime per se.
Right.
And so then can we even question like from that perspective, like what is actually true, what and where is this coming from? So it's kind of the same. Anyway, so there's that side of it. But then I think the other side is like, what happens when we're only using our practice, whether it's meditation, whether it's I'm doing this coaching program because I don't know, want to build my business, or, I mean, I guess building a business might be a little bit different, but so maybe we can talk more about like a healing modality, but that it's, or another kind of spiritual practice when it's solely for our own benefit. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that's the other side of this conversation, right? What happens when it's really for our benefit and we're not actually thinking about the larger whole? Right. And are we really, I mean, I would even ask the question, right? Are we really then, is that true healing if it's
Mm-hmm.
not impacting the larger, like if it's only impacting my individual, well, I mean, my individual life's important, but
Right.
if
Mm-hmm.
it's only
Mm-hmm.
impacting that and it's not, we're not kind of like using it to
Yeah.
support, you know, the whole, we could
Right.
say.
Yeah. Yeah. It's one of the things I think that we see happening a lot today, um, in the wellness industry, right? Which is um, the emphasis on individual healing that is so unquestioned because it's a reflection of the ethos of individualism that's at the core of Western culture, right? And this kind of hyper focus on me, how I feel, and what I need, to the exclusion of what's happening around me, and then the market forces of capitalism kind of are founded upon that, and so then we get this sense of the whole business model influencing the actual experiences of the practices and the modalities, reinforcing the sense of self-focus and happiness coming from me feeling good, essentially. Um, it's tragic. It's tragic to me on multiple levels, because going back to the Dharma, going back to Buddha's teachings, you know, the development of the Buddha's teachings over time, as the Dharma traveled and as the Mahayana developed, the emphasis shifted to for the benefit of all beings, right? That sense of understanding that one's own liberation is actually tied to the awakening and liberation of others. So it's there in the Buddhist tradition very clearly, as well as, you know, teachings on compassion. Um, I think I see two things when we start looking at that dynamic that you're naming of healing and wellness practices being solely focused on the individual, or I should say maybe three things. So one is that very focus itself is a reflection of the kind of social caste within which the wellness industry is arising and operating. Because it's only possible to focus on individual healing if you're in the privileged caste of our society. Like if your sons and daughters and nieces and nephews and brothers and sisters and siblings and, you know, are not getting gunned down, are not, you know, struggling to make rent and put food on the table, that's the only way you cannot be focused on the healing and oppression and suffering of others, is if you're not experiencing it directly, or you're not connected to those who are. Because if you were, it just wouldn't be thinkable to focus only on one's own healing. So I think that's the first thing, is just the very fact that, like, you and I are having this conversation, and that the whole industry that our work operates in is, you know, limited by this, is a reflection of the people it's serving and the sort of social and historical context out of which it arose. Or I should say, like, the majority of people that it's catering to, because it's serving much broader. So that's one. Maybe I can pause there, see if you want to comment on that before continuing on my rant.
No, I want to hear the rest of your rant. I think it's good.
Okay. So two is, and I'm probably going to forget the third, but maybe it'll come back. So two is that two is, if that view is unquestioned, if we don't become aware of that, like, oh, I'm only focusing on myself, and what is the relationship to the broader society and those who aren't making ends meet or benefiting from the structures of our society, then the tragedy is that the wellness industry ends up actually reinforcing the social order. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And this is one of the main critiques of secular mindfulness, Buddhist practice to a certain degree, and a whole range of healing practices, is that essentially what you're doing is you're helping people to be more comfortable with the way things are. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So you're basically putting people to sleep. Mm-hmm. Because when we live in a world where a handful of people control, I don't know the statistics, but something ridiculous like 90% of global wealth, right? Where the life support systems of the planet are being actively destroyed. It's like being comfortable is not an appropriate response. Mm-hmm. Like, we are meant to feel disturbed and ill at ease right now based on the circumstances. If your house were on fire, you wouldn't be focused on like, how can I feel more relaxed? It's like, get the F out of the house and, and put the fire out. So one of the critiques is, if, whether you're teaching meditation or doing psychotherapy or any number of healing modalities, if you're just helping people to feel more relaxed and at ease and comfortable, you're not actually addressing one of the key causes of the dis-ease, which is social and not personal. And in doing so, you're actively complicit in reinforcing the status quo that is creating so much suffering and misery for millions and millions of people. Mm-hmm. So that's number two. Number three is the misperception that I kind of just touched on, the misperception that the suffering we're experiencing is only individual, and that it can actually be healed or cured here. Mm-hmm. And, I think this is one of the things that the Black community has been saying for over a generation, that, James Baldwin was really clear about, like, this nation doesn't have a Negro problem, it has a white problem. Like, the issue is not with the Black community, it's with the white community. And like, white people need to start looking at themselves and looking at their own conditioning and looking at the way individually and systemically things are set up. So what I'm pointing to here is, like, whether you're looking at racism or sexism or homophobia or transphobia, classism, ableism, like, the privileged and dominant group is also affected and suffering, but that suffering is often not seen or acknowledged by those who are in the dominant position. I'm not suggesting that the suffering is equal. Mm-hmm. But until those who are in a society that are benefiting from the systems of oppression recognize, I suffer too from this, mm-hmm. through fear, through moral distress, then there's not going to be the impetus and the genuine commitment to transformation.
And you could add through guilt and shame, which is one of the reasons that white people, for example, don't,
yes. Right.
Look at their stuff because of that. So
yeah,
that's
absolutely
work to kind of shift
absolutely.
It. It's there's so much that you said, but I really appreciate the last perspective, because I think, this is such an important conversation. And then when we think of privilege, it's often, there's something that like clicked for me when you said, like, we're all suffering, even though it's to different degrees. I think it's true that if everybody could, and that's also obviously at the heart of, the Buddhist teachings, like, oh, there's suffering and there's actually a reason for that. Now you're taking it beyond what the Buddha said, right? Because you're saying there's a reason for it because of how our society is set up. Mm-hmm. There are some people that have and some people that don't, because, there's racism, there's sexism, there's whatever, all these things. And there is, was I just thinking? Yeah, anyway, so that there's like something out. I mean, I love your example too, of like, that there's, if you burned yourself, you wouldn't just be like, you would be like, oh, I burned myself, so this hurts.
Right.
So it's like there's something real that's happening. And so having to look at that. So, I mean, something like Buddhism, right? This is the very heart of why potentially, you know, because the Buddhist teachings were not around this kind of these external factors. It was more around these kind of internal factors of why one might suffer. So I can see how you'd kind of, at least from that perspective, you'd have to, like, it's a whole new framework, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
It
to
is and
some,
it isn't. It is and it isn't. I mean, I think it's fascinating, and it starts to get into some nuance. But on the one hand, yes, if you look back at the records we have of the early Buddhist teachings, the emphasis is on the sources of suffering that arise from our own mind. And from one perspective, there's something still very powerful and deeply liberating about recognizing that the way the mind functions and the way we relate to the world creates our experience of it. And that there is a deep potential for an inner freedom that comes from working with the patterns and forces of the mind. And I'm a firm believer in that. I've seen it myself, and it's like water in the desert. You know, that those teachings, and this is not unique to the Dharma. I mean, this is a kind of universal truth. It's what Nelson Mandela, you know, realized when he was in prison on Robben Island, when he said, you know, when I walked out the gates to the prison that would lead to my freedom, I knew that if I didn't leave behind the hatred and bitterness, that I would still be in prison. You know, it's that sense that how we relate to even the most extreme conditions of oppression determines our own sense of inner well-being and freedom. So there is a truth there. And at the same time, there's to only look at that is limiting, I think, because of this fact that our personal or inner experience is conditioned and created by the external world, or the external world. Those boundaries obviously are not so firm. And what's fascinating about the Buddhist teachings is that even though there aren't, to my knowledge, explicit examples in the early texts of a kind of social analysis of suffering, saying like, yes, the causes of suffering are individual, interpersonal, and social. Like, you don't find that in the early texts. However, the framework for that insight is present. Because the whole logic of the Buddha's teachings is that nothing exists independently and everything is conditioned through relationship. So the very foundation of the teaching is a sense of understanding dialectics, understanding the way conditions come together to create experience, and not holding on, not fixating on anything. So the teachings themselves contain the seeds of transformation of the teaching, to recognize like this teaching can evolve because it's not fixed, because the whole teaching is that nothing is fixed.
Got it.
So you take those teachings of, you know, how does the self arise? It arises through experience and through relationship. That very framework, that very logic gets applied, and you look around and you say, oh, well, this is what's happening. It's like, why are millions of people depressed? Why are millions of people anxious and ill at ease? Well, just look at the conditions of the world we're living in, where communities are broken down, people are isolated, they don't have meaningful work, we're not getting enough touch, we're alienated from many of us, from our ancestry and our roots, and from a sense of belonging and purpose, all of the things that are so essential to human well-being. Like, of course, you're going to have hundreds of millions of people that are depressed and anxious when those are the conditions that we're being kind of raised in.
It's really interesting, because in that was a beautiful answer, and to my inquiry into that, I guess. And what I was actually within that, you also said like what the way through is, right? Because what I was thinking when you were speaking about even the core of the Buddhist teachings is that the more that you're able to see a way out of suffering, see a way through suffering, or see that, that everything arises in the mind, let's say, that then you're actually able to free oneself, right? One can free themselves and then actually take action in the world, because they're not kind of, like, then you can, what I was thinking is that then you can actually, you're free enough to make the choices that are going to contribute not only to your own individual life, but to society and to the collective, right?
Yeah.
Like, for example, with the issue, let's say, like what I said about shame and guilt, let's say for white people around privilege, or around, not being open to looking at our own stuff, which we all have, right? It's like, if you can actually apply the practice, then it's like there's some freeing up of those emotions, like seeing how they're created by the mind, so that there's more openness to actually, inquire deeper, to get involved, to do things that are going to make a difference in the world.
Yeah. And that's what inspires me these days, and some of the learning and reading and kind of work and training I'm doing is how do we bring together these different liberation movements, the kind of internal individual liberation movement and the social liberation movement. It's not just me. I mean, there's a whole community of folks interested in spiritual activism and bringing together the healing movements and healing practices with movements for social transformation and social justice. And there's controversy and tension around that, and there's also a lot of synergy and beautiful connections happening, and the recognition that like each of these frameworks and modalities and communities have gifts and insights to offer each other, and that cross-fertilization, that cross-pollination has been happening in different ways for over a generation. I mean, like this organization, the Buddhist Peace Fellowship, that I used to work for, that was founded in the 70s, I think, by Robert Aitken Roshi and some other folks in the Zen community, was, that was the heart of it. And Thich Nhat Hanh's socially engaged Buddhism, like this whole movement from the spiritual world to recognize we need to do more than just look at ourselves. And the recognition that in activist communities, the levels of burnout are really high. The quality of the relationships and the kind of like infighting that happens sometimes can be as bad, if not worse, than the tension and fighting that happens across political divides or divides of around different issues. So there's a lot that can happen when we start to bring these two together and have an understanding of how they can support each other. It's not that one needs to take the place of the other or that they need to be done together, but the recognition that like we can't be fully effective in either domain if we're not attending to both. Like if we're not attending to the heart and to our own trauma and to our own personal healing, our work for social transformation will be limited because we're going to burn out. We're going to project our own pain and suffering into relationships and into the movement. And we're ultimately risk kind of reinforcing the dynamics of othering in the work for transformation. And as we've been talking about in the kind of personal healing world, this is maybe getting into the second question you asked at the beginning, like if our purpose is limited to, gee, I want to be happier, like that's great, that's wonderful. And that's only going to take you so far, because there's not, like personal happiness is not only is it fleeting, but it's not deeply satisfying. Like true satisfaction comes from helping others. It comes from being connected to something larger than ourselves. So in that individual healing realm, having a connection with the larger social forces or something in your life that is bigger than yourself will add fuel to the fire of transformation that you're working with.
Yeah, and then where would you put things that are like where people are doing personal healing or transformation and it's for maybe something other than like, because I mean, we're talking about it very largely for the world or for, that you're almost saying like if we could say like if nobody's free, if everybody's not free, then you're not really free, you could say. Where would you put kind of some of those middle ground where someone has a larger purpose, but maybe the purpose is like, just trying to think of an example. Like
your
here I have
family.
one, like maybe there's women who are making, because this happens in the coaching industry quite a bit. They're like, I'm making 7 figures and I want to help other people make 7 figures. I want to help women make 7 figures. I mean, I'm serious because this happens all the time.
Right.
Right. Like there is a larger purpose potentially, or like, I want to, right. But is it coming from the right place? I mean,
I want to help other privileged people make more money.
Exactly. Well, you're not that tapped in. I mean, I'm coming towards the end of our call, but
yeah,
like really, I mean, this is sort of what this show was almost founded on, was like, wow, we're so right. There's such a focus on like the dangling carrot that's out there, like the thing I want, or, the bit like in the coaching industry, there's a lot of emphasis, like what's your bigger why? And sometimes it's like, arguably the bigger why, I mean, everybody's sovereign. They get to choose what their bigger why is, but then, right. Like,
yeah, I hear you.
How do we even know, right? That we're not, how does one know, and obviously these teachings can really help with that we're not just kind of in it for our own sort of selfish or.
Yeah. Well, it's a great question. And I'm so glad that you're asking the question and that you're doing this show and raising these issues within your community. I guess there, this about me, my mind works. There are 2 things. There are 3 things. So there are 3 things. So one, I want to this is kind of off topic of the question you just asked. I just want to go back to the thing I was saying before and also acknowledge, like, I also really want to make space for like, when we're suffering, we do need to attend to that personally. And I don't want to invalidate the efforts that individuals are making to feel happier. Right? Like it's the whole, kind of cliched thing. You have to put on your own oxygen mask first. Like you can't help anyone else when you're debilitated by depression or anxiety. Right. It's like,
we could add to that. I think I'm glad that you said that sometimes people have to do that work for a period of time before they can actually help someone else.
Yes. Yeah.
And then it's not just like a one-time thing, or it doesn't always work in a weave. Like sometimes that's actually the thing that people need to do for a long period of time on its own, because that's what's going to support everything.
Yeah. Yeah. And like you said, there's just so many permutations of it. And in one person's unfolding, really having that self-focus for a period of time may be what's needed. And in another person's path, starting to do service or volunteer work or get involved with something can be really healing. So I just wanted to make space for that, and not present things as being too one-sided or rigid here. In terms of the question you're asking, like, about, what is the purpose and how is that, how do we check that? I think there are 2 things that come to mind for me. One is even if the purpose is this sense of like a very limited sphere, like, oh, I want to do this, I want to help people make more money. The carrot keeps receding, and anyone who's paying attention eventually will realize this isn't doing it for me. Like if you're sincere and you're looking and asking the question, you can run through that cycle and delusion of, self-enrichment as the purpose, or helping others enrich themselves as the purpose. But, if you're actually looking closely, it will become clear something's off here. This is not deeply satisfying. And there will be that dissatisfaction. So that's one, like, eventually that's going to catch up with you, because it's not aligned with how we're wired as human beings. Like, selfishness hurts. Generosity feels good. Like, that's just how we're wired. So if you're looking closely enough, that's going to become revealed eventually, I believe. The other thing, though, is that, and this is why I think, like, your work that people like you can do on an individual level, and the larger movements in society to raise awareness about oppression, anti-Blackness, why these are so important is because, so take the coaching industry and this framework that you named of, like, what's your why, right? So this goes back to where we started from in terms of meditation. So if I'm meditating and I'm looking at my own mind, but I'm not questioning the vantage point that I'm looking from and how that's been conditioned and created by society, I'm only going to see certain things. Mm-hmm. It's the same with coaching. If you come to this question of what's your why, but you don't zoom out and ask, who's asking that question?
Yeah.
And how did you come up with that question? And what's the context that you're asking that question in? Then the very investigation of that question is it contains social forces. Yeah. And it's going to just reinforce and recapitulate those same dynamics in the community. So I would say that there's a need to actually step back and infuse in the very model of the wellness industry, whether you're talking about coaching or psychotherapy or meditation, infuse a systemic perspective that says, yeah, some of our suffering is due to the structure of our society. And there are these forces of supremacy and dominance that show up, whether it's as patriarchy or white supremacy or homophobia, that are embedded in our minds because of the soup that we're all swimming in. Yeah. And if we don't start there, if we don't bring that awareness and that lens in, then the questions we ask are going to be limited in scope, and they're going to reinforce those things. But if we do that, then when we get to the question of what's your why, now there's a larger framework to examine that question and say, oh, well, I'm looking from this perspective. Mm-hmm. And how can I broaden that perspective in how I ask the question?
I love that answer so much. And, it also made me think about, because something that I have a vested interest in as I've kind of because I've come from a different background of being a therapist, is that, I also think that and I've spoken out about this a lot, but I also think the coaching industry in the same way, it's a little different, but needs more of that perspective on trauma and how trauma works. It
Absolutely.
needs that perspective on ethics, and morality, because, from a therapist point of view, I was taught ethics. I had massive supervision around ethics. I worked with many people, clients, and then had support around that. And in the coaching industry, there's none of this as a framework.
Yeah.
And so I think there does need to be people, in all of these realms, right? Like there needs to be anti-racism trainings. There needs to be, all of these factors. And so it's so important. I love how you said it. And then I think the why would be informed in a very different way with all of that.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's, and it's tragic and sad to me the way this conversation gets so politicized. Mm-hmm. And becomes about things that it gets made to be about things that are actually, from my view, not inherent. Because really, like for me, if I step back and look at it, it's about how do we reduce human suffering and support human thriving in our communities? And it's like, well, if we're going to ask that question, we have to step back and say, okay, what are we dealing with? Let's look at the landscape first before we address that question. Whether it's, like we've been saying, whether you're looking at spirituality, psychotherapy, coaching, and yes, like if we step back and ask that question, of course, what we're going to find is, gee, there's a history of colonialism in imperialism around the world. Gee, there's a history of anti-Blackness. Gee, there's a history of trauma, personally and intergenerationally, right? Oh, let's think about how we can do this work in this context, because that is the context. And if we're not naming it and incorporating it, then we're not going to be as effective in our work.
Absolutely. I mean, I think what you just said is, the last part too, this is a good place to end because but I mean, I think the last part of what you said too, we're not as effective, but we're also, I think that what I love about what you said, and I've seen this in my own direct experience, I think in entry, both as a therapist and then being now in this field as more of a mentor coach, is that I often have struggled with the why because because I've also struggled to at times take in the larger perspective. And I think when we do take in all of these things, then that why becomes a lot easier. And then it's true, we can be effective with every, we know the why is so much bigger, and then we're able to hold people in a totally different way and help people transform in a completely different way. So, I mean, it serves in both ways.
Yeah, and I would even go one step further to what I said and say, and it's not only that we're not going to be as effective, but we might actually end up unintentionally causing harm or through omission, if not through commission, like by being complicit and reinforcing things, if not by like missing things and actively doing harm.
Well, I mean, I've seen that I've definitely seen that in the coaching industry. I also see that in, my early days, like living in, at IMS and in Buddhist community, right? Like all the different ways that happens. And that's been my interest in this industry quite a bit as I've entered it, because I feel as though there is a lot of harm that is done because there isn't enough of the proper training, which is what we are talking about. It's all of this stuff is a matter of training, right? It's a matter of learning. It's a matter of investigation, right? It's a matter of looking through a different lens.
Yeah. And to that end, just to be clear, like so much of what we've talked about today, from like everything I know about the Dharma to the ideas that we're discussing about the relationship between individual and social healing and liberation are not my own ideas. Like it comes from, in the Buddhist world, my Buddhist teachers, and in terms of this conversation about individual and social, from other teachers and people that I've been studying with and reading, many of whom are people of color. And so it's really like just to bring that into the conversation, like one, not wanting to claim some sense of authority here, and two, really like honoring the sense that we can all be in this together and learn from each other.
Thank you so much. This was such a wonderful conversation and so needed. And I'm glad that people are, the conversation as a whole is so important, and what we've touched on at the end, but also for people that may not have known that much about also the Buddhist teachings, and also about how to, sort of the influence of social forces and with that particular practice. So thank you so much. I would love for people who don't know you to be able to know how to follow you or get in touch with you, and what kind of, offerings that you have or courses that you teach.
Sure. So my website, orenjaysofer.com, is probably the best place to just find out about my work and see what's happening. I lead classes and workshops and retreats throughout the year. And then I try to post stuff that's uplifting and raising awareness around these issues of personal and social transformation on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. So you can find me there on any of those platforms at Oren Jay Sofer.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Lori. It's great to see you.
Yeah, you too. Thank you everyone for tuning in. Okay, bye.